You mentioned China, and you've looked most recently in detail in your report on China and the measures it's taking to address climate change through its policy and strategies on emissions. You've also noted that China has been portrayed as a laggard in this area and that you consider that's an unfair assessment. Could you review some of the key points that China is addressing currently?
Yeah, I think that in the Western press, and particularly I think the US is a little bit more guilty of this than the EU, but we find a sort of, there's a tendency to kind of say, well, if China was willing to come to the table, that everything would be resolved. But when we look at any sort of sense of kind of what would be fair or equitable for an international treaty, and you look at the level of wealth or emissions per capita in the US compared to China, in a GDP per capita basis or the emissions per capita basis, you can see that really the US has to really come forward and take a much stronger effort. If you look at sort of historic responsibility for climate change, you can see that the Chinese historical responsibility for the problem is much less than the EU or the US. So it's only in terms of current emissions that the Chinese look extremely bad, and they are by far the largest polluter, and of course China needs to be part of any international agreement. But the sort of finger pointing is less than entirely constructive. And I think that if you look at China, what China is actually doing, China is making a huge effort to decarbonize, and some of the pressure is coming from the air pollution area, where coal is leading to huge air pollution in a lot of the Chinese cities. But I think the Chinese have come forward with a very ambitious pledge for 2030, and I think that can be the starting point rather than the end of the debate, and I think that pledge can be more ambitious. But I think that what you've seen is that the National Development and Reform Commission in China, which is a very powerful, it's sometimes described as a super ministry, is responsible for the climate agenda, has come forward with a very ambitious climate plan, and we can see that percolating down into some of the things that are happening in China in terms of China is the largest investor in renewables globally. It is now developing some very leading brands and leading companies in this area, and green tech is seen as a huge opportunity in China. We've seen a trailing off in coal investment, and in fact we've seen a reduction in coal emissions over the last couple of years in China, which is a very dramatic development. I mean, emissions from coal were increasing 10% per annum for the last 20 years, and now all of a sudden coal pollution has actually declined in China over the last 18 months or so. It's a little bit too early to tell if this is just a response to China's current economic woes, or if this is a sign of a longer-term trend. But certainly positive signs in China that China is moving away from coal and towards cleaner, greener fuels and technologies. There's a huge amount of work to be done in China. It's a very, very difficult problem to solve, but I think that we have to see the positive as well as the negative, and I think sometimes when we look at China we only see the negative.